All
right.
You watch Rick and Morty?
Here comes most everybody.
From what I've seen, I like it.
Rick and
I'll
Morty.
be back on Monday.
Yeah. You need to watch that.
Well,
All right.
Professor,
Yes.
can I recommend you a show to watch?
Oh, no.
please, no.
You should watch a show called Rick and Morty.
Why are you doing
What?
You should watch a show called Rick and Morty.
It's a really stupid show, but it's funny.
Right.
Hey,
master
why do you
piece.
like this, dude?
I love it.
Okay, folks, we need to start. We got a lot to do. I'm on now chapter 18. The stuff I say here will not be on the test, but again, I'm going to start the test at the end of the class. We'll have a break at 12 noon instead of 12:30 today. For obvious reasons, 12 noon will be the halfway point in the class. All right. One thing I want to throw in, I didn't last time, this story is about Rene Descartes. Descartes is famous for the saying, I think, therefore I am. So one day he was having a tea, we had a cafe, and a waitress came up to him and said, do you want another tea? And he said, I think not. And he vanished. He ceased to exist. No longer thinking, no longer existing. All right, leaving that. Oh yeah, something I never mentioned about Mozart. Today, if you want to get ahead in the music world or the art world, you have to be able to sell your art or sell your music. If you write a novel, you have to be able to sell it. But in those days, they had to find a patron, that is, some very rich person, usually a king or a nobleman, who would sponsor them. Strangely enough, Mozart never found a patron. Kind of sad, but in some ways, maybe he was better off. The patron would have controlled it. So that means he was free to compose his own way and do his own thing. But again, in today's world, we don't have a patron. A lot of famous people never found a patron. In China, Confucius, the founder of the Confucian religion, never found a patron, never found anyone to sponsor him. I mean, Confucius tried hard. But today it's looked on as, hey, we don't need patrons. If your ideas are right, if your art is good, if your music is popular, you can sell it, and you don't have to worry about finding a patron. All right. These social sciences, as such, began. These people started believing that society followed the same laws that science did, and that you could use the scientific method to determine how people behave. That if governments could just learn the right science, they could control their people. Now, folk, I know from what I know about science, if you put water on a stove, when that water temperature gets 212 degrees, it will boil. Over and over again, you can prove that now. There is an exception. If you take most of the air out of the room, in fact, you take all the air out of the room, the water will start to boil as soon as it melts. On the moon, there is no liquid water. The water there is either ice, or if the ice evaporates, the ice becomes steam. It does not have a liquid state. You have to have air. If the air pressure were greater, the temperature of the boiling water would be greater, and so on and so forth. Or, the reason I've grabbed this phone, if you put together another device, just like this one, the other device will do the same thing this device will do. That is hard science. But human beings do not lend themselves to science. Adam Smith was like one of the founders of social science, and he believed that economics followed logical patterns that we could figure out. Now, there is such a thing as, it's worthwhile to study the economy. Economics is a course well worth taking. It will benefit you, it will help you, but you cannot use the scientific method to predict the stock market. There are persons who use beads to predict the market. and every once in a while they get burned. You can try, well, when the market does this and this, it's going to do that. The next thing, the market does this and this, and then does this again. You can't predict it. Now, there are a few people who seem to be better at it than others, but ultimately, everybody who dabbles in the market gets burned sooner or later. A few people get rich from it. But again, it is not a science, in that it does not behave the same way every time. Now, we now also do not only study economics, but we study sociology, psychology. And again, to me, these are worthwhile things to study, but you won't find a scientific law that will be applicable and work every time for everybody. Now, many years ago, hey, I enjoy reading about men and women like, well, Jesse James, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone. Any of you know what all these men had in common, and women? They were all
Criminals?
they were all bad people. I used to think I could figure out what made them that way. You get to saying, hey, you can't figure out what made them that way. At some point, they just decided to be the way they were. It wasn't that society failed them. You can have a person who grows up in the slums and grows up in deep poverty who becomes a medical doctor. And at the same time, a person who grows up rich becomes an outlaw. The man who shot Reagan grew up in a rich family with rich parents, Hinckley by name. He grew up wealthy. But he had a mental issue. All right, anyway, high culture, your higher society, Europeans began to think differently than the lower class people. Now, if you go back farther, during the high Middle Ages, you will find that the rich people, the nobles, were just as superstitious and just as religious, perhaps, as the lower classes, if not even more so. But the higher up people, most of them remained Christian, but they gave up beliefs in fortune telling, faith healing, astrology, gave up a lot of these beliefs. They quit visiting fortune tellers and persons who looked at crystal balls, and they began to look down on others who did. This high culture, people who were generally from the wealthy and higher educated, the popular culture, the lower class. Now, if they were around today, they might be appalled at what they would see in today's music. They would consider what we like in music as being low class. In other words, the high culture people like Mozart, Bach, Handel, those people, that was considered high culture. The low culture, country music, men like Elvis Presley, etc., etc. Those kind, they were considered, hey, again, if you like Elvis, fine and dandy, I do too. But by the standards of that time, he would have been considered popular culture. And again, Elvis Presley used his music to rake in millions of dollars. The idea that he would need a sponsor, he didn't need one and didn't want one, but he had a manager who controlled him pretty well, and I think helped send him to an early grave. But anyway, the different high culture, for the higher ups, the more educated, the highborn, and they made fun of the people who still believed in magic, superstitious people, etc., etc. Now, and speaking of superstitious, I forgot to mention last time when I was talking about Kepler. Kepler had a mother who was extremely superstitious. And finally, the people around her started accusing her of witchcraft. Kepler, being a famous scientist and popular, was able for a time to keep his mother out of court. But finally, a judge set a court date and said, you're to appear in court at this certain date. Fortunately for Mrs. Kepler, she died before the court date. She had no chance at all of winning a witchcraft trial. in that time, that period. And the penalty for witchcraft, as you may know, was often death. Again, the poor woman somehow got sidetracked and I guess couldn't help it and couldn't give up her superstitious practices, superstitious cures. All right. Now, they became, well, the Enlightenment taught that religion should be a personal matter and everybody should be free to choose one's own way. Well, a lot of leaders found it difficult to comply with this. Louis XIV of France insisted that all French become Catholic, and Louis XV, who followed him, also insisted the same thing, and so did Louis XVI. France did not get freedom of religion until Napoleon took over. And Napoleon, who was himself Catholic, insisted that the French allow anyone to be anything. By that time, the Huguenots were all driven out of France. Some countries welcomed the Huguenots. Now, as I already mentioned, how that Spain expelled all Protestants and Jews, and a lot of the Jews who were expelled from Spain went to other countries and became wealthy bankers for other kings and helped make other countries wealthy. And I've told you already how the 2 kings of Spain in a row went bankrupt. Perhaps if these kings would have known that, hey, you've got to let your Jews in your country because they know how to manage banks, they know how to manage large sums of money. So you need to let them in. But they didn't see it that way. Now, with all respect to the Spanish, they lived for 700 years with the Muslims living in their country, and the Muslims were prone to conduct raiding parties and rob everything that they could get their hands on. I can understand why they drive these kind of people out. No, I mean, okay, there's going to be a person come here and speak in a few days on that very topic. But I can understand it. But nevertheless, they then used that same zeal that they used to get the Moors out to drive out Jews and Protestants also, when they really did not need to and shouldn't have. Spain lost some of its best citizens. Spain was destined to become a poor country and remain poor to this day. And like I say, a lot of the people whom they expelled went off and become wealthy and helped make other countries wealthy and make other kings wealthier. Nevertheless, Jews became persecuted. The King of England, well, one King of England invited them in, but then a later King of England expelled them. The French also expelled them. I've mentioned how the Spanish and Portuguese expelled them. Make a long story short, the Jews began to drift eastward toward Poland, and this was to set them up for the Holocaust that was to come later. And a lot of them went to Germany also. So they concentrated themselves in Germany and Poland, and then in the mid-1940s, because they were concentrating in that part of Europe, Hitler had a fairly easy time rounding them up, but that's a subject for a later chapter. The big problem was, now folks, let me make clear, I mean, in no way do I in any way want to condone persecution of Jews. My wife is descended from Jews herself, but the big issue was the Jews did not believe that Jesus Christ was the promised Messiah, and this kept them apart from the rest of Europeans. I mean, that's simply a historical fact. Some Jews did. Every generation has had Jews who have believed that Jesus was Messiah from the time of the beginning of Christianity all the way down. Some Jews have believed it. Most have not. Jews had to pay an excess tax. They were not allowed to own property. They never knew when their neighbors would rise against them. The rising up against Jews had a special name called a pogrom. And again, the worst pogroms in all of history was to occur at the time when your grandparents were young. In other words, very recently. So it's not necessarily a thing of the past. The hatred of Jews is sometimes called anti-Semitism, named after Shem, the son of Noah, because the Jews are descended from Shem, son of Noah, according to their belief and the belief of a lot of folk. In other words, against Shem, again, anti-Semitic. Now, as the scientific revolution came on the scene, religious fervor died down at first. Now, it's hard to tell. Among the Catholics, maybe it didn't die, but among the Protestants, religion died down, and making a living, making rich became more than of what they wanted to do. But again, folk, this thing goes around in cycles. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, my grandpa Cunningham was very indifferent about matters of religion. My dad was extremely, almost to the point of fanatical and religious. I've seen a lot of time when the parents are indifferent, the children become very religious. So when the parents are extremely religious, the children become much less so.
Right.
A lot of times these things swap around from one generation to another. So this lack of religious fervor, during the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants had a lot of religious fervor. Then during the early part of the Enlightenment, the fervor died down. And most of your clergy, Protestant clergy, were very, very highly educated people. To become a clergyman, you had to go to a big university, particularly a big name university, and get your degree in theology. Well, along came a man named the Wesley brothers. There were two of them, John and Charles. Actually, they came from a family of 17 children. I say 17 children, only 8 of them grew to adulthood. Now, this was very common in those days because they did not know about sanitation and cleanliness. But the two Wesley brothers, John and Charles, got a new movement started. In fact, the movement called for enthusiastic worship, and it also called for the belief that you had to experience salvation. Now, again, I'm not saying you were right, you understand, but nevertheless, they did change a lot of the course of theology among Protestants, particularly in Great Britain and the United States. They started the Wesley revivals, where that people became extreme in their religious fervor. Now, the revivals did not always last, but they emphasized a lot of what we might call shouting, crying, or whatever, emotion, more so than had ever been seen among Christians. And you still have a lot of that today, extreme emotion. The Anglican Church did not like it, so Wesley formed his own denomination, which is called Methodism. He is the founder of the Methodist Church. Now today, the Methodist Church does not practice what Wesley initially taught. They don't practice extreme emotion, but other groups took it up. Particularly, the Quakers were extremely emotional in their worship. And then, of course, later came the Pentecostals, who copied a lot of John Wesley's doctrines. In other words, Christianity was far from dead. All right, we'll move on. Well, again, it's not that I want to teach theology, but theology does become important sometimes. Very important, and without it, I mean, it's like telling the story of the Titanic and leaving out that part about the iceberg. You can't leave out theology when talking about any civilization, whether it be Chinese civilization, Indian civilization. When we study India, we always talk about Hinduism and Buddhism. When we study Chinese civilization, we have to talk about Confucianism. It's a big part of their existence. All right. In the 1700s, Europe's population grew. Well, why? I think the number one reason is the Ice Age ended, what we call the Little Ice Age, and the climate got warmer. As the climate got warmer, plant life got better. Farmers could plant a crop at a reasonable time and never have to worry about the frost killing the crop, either a spring frost or a fall frost. The growing season was longer. The bubonic plague disappeared from Europe. Now, how did the bubonic plague disappear? One thing, Europeans developed better immunity thanks to better diet. But for another thing, the persons who were susceptible to the plague all pretty well died off, and the persons who were born with a natural immunity, they were the ones who survived. So now, I'll say this about the bubonic plague. I was listening to the radio just yesterday, and in one of America's big cities, there's a real problem that might bring the bubonic plague right back among us. The city is Los Angeles, and Los Angeles has tens of thousands of homeless people who are living in the absolute filthiest of conditions. How many of you are aware of that? Okay, yeah, a few of you, 3 or 4 hands are going up, yeah. But no, it's a real problem. I was thinking it could bring typhoid fever back to us, and even the bubonic plague again. But anyway, the bubonic plague at this time disappeared from Europe, and it's rarely been seen or since then. Seen since then. Now, another thing, 2 things happened that helped bring the population. A man named Louis Pasteur, we associate his name with pasteurization. Back in the early 1600s, a man named Leeuwenhoek, who was a glasses maker, made eyeglasses, he put a couple of lenses together and made a microscope. And he saw these really tiny living creatures. I mean, you could tell they were alive, they could swim around. But Pasteur said these little creatures are what causes disease. And he said they can be killed by boiling water, by heating food, or even by freezing, boiling, whatever. These can be killed. And also they can be killed by, well, washing your food off, washing off. So Pasteur, and he's also given credit for pasteurization. Typhoid fever was a lot of times spread through milk. Well, all the milk that we buy today is pasteurized. That is, it's been made free of germs. So we should not today get typhoid fever from the milk that we drink. So between discovering that germs cause disease and that germs can be killed, this did a lot to make sure that more people who were born grew up. I mentioned how that Susanna Wesley had 17 children, only 8 of them grew up. Well, if Susanna Wesley would have had her children about 75 years later, probably of her 17 children, 15 of them would have grown up, instead of merely 8. Again, thanks to better methods of sanitation. The other thing that helped was the smallpox. The smallpox vaccination. Discovered by a man named Jenner. William Jenner. Now, William Jenner, studying smallpox, noticed that young girls who milked cows never got smallpox. Well, he began to wonder, now wait a minute, if I could infect people with a mild case of smallpox, perhaps I can get them immune to disease. Also, he noticed that once you had smallpox, if you recovered from it, you would never get it again. Now that's not as true we know it's not quite as true as Jenner thought it was. We know that our body builds up antibodies. So if you had it, but so William Jenner infected a few people with some cowpox, and some of them developed a mild case of cowpox, which is the same as smallpox, really. But they never got smallpox. This is the beginning of the smallpox vaccination, and it has done a lot to almost wipe out smallpox. Now, we don't do that anymore, but in my day, everybody who went to school had a smallpox scar. I'm not going to show mine, but a smallpox scar on her left arm. My great aunt never had one because she milked cows from the time she was a preschooler, and when she was 6, and they gave her the smallpox vaccination, it wouldn't take. They tried again, it wouldn't take. They finally gave up because she had had cowpox. And but see, when they gave her the smallpox vaccine, I remember swelling up, festering in that part of my arm. Then it would eventually burst open. When I was in the Army, they gave me another one because they figured after 24 years, they gave us all smallpox vaccination again. Now, I don't know if they even vaccinate against smallpox anymore because the disease is not around. I do know this, I gave all my children all the shots that were required, and my wife might know more about what you were given. But one of my sisters does not believe in vaccinations. That's another issue. I do. Vaccinations have done a lot to eradicate smallpox, to eradicate typhus, and a whole lot of other diseases. I do believe in it. I mean, I know there might be issues with side effects, but the side effect is not as bad as the disease itself in most cases. The corn and the potato came from the New World to the Old, and they were grown in Europe. That is Indian corn. Now, corn is not necessarily a highly nutritious plant, as I mentioned before. The potato is. Now, to keep this in mind, folks, about the potato. All right, I'm going to ask you, does any one of you know what a potato seed looks like? You don't. I don't either. There is no such thing. They don't exist.
Don't potatoes just grow out of other potatoes?
They simply chop up a potato and plant it in the ground, and it grows up. And then when it grows up and produces more potatoes, one of them will chop up. All right, the same thing is true of bananas and blackberries. Bananas reproduce by simply spreading out. Blackberries, my wife bought one blackberry stem home one time, and I planted it. It's now taken over several square feet of my garden. And the blackberries are good. I mean, this is blackberry season. All right. Now, but see, here was the problem with the potatoes that they took to Ireland. One Irish man bought one potato. Bought one potato to Ireland, and all the Irish potatoes were descended from that one potato. If he had bought 8 or 10 potatoes, well, what this led to was a blight hit the land of Ireland in the 1840s and killed about a third of Ireland's population with starvation, because this blight was especially bad for the type of potato that was being made in Ireland, grown in Ireland. The other potatoes were immune to it. All right, yes.
Isn't it also because potatoes made up a good portion of their just general diet because of the soil there?
The potato grew really well, and also, you're right, they made the mistake of their diet for breakfast, lunch, dinner, supper, whatever was based around potatoes. And if the potato would only been like 10% of their diet, and if they had about 10 different potatoes to choose from. Now, I've heard that the banana is facing the same thing. There's a blight going around among our banana plants, but then we found another type of variety of banana that is not susceptible to blight. So we're not about to run out of bananas. But a few years ago, they were saying that all bananas that we eat are descended from one banana that's susceptible to this blight. But like I said, we wound up finding a way to breed a banana that's immune. But anyway, the diet got better, and folk, now, as the climate got warmer, life got better, and your climatologists today are going to tell you that the climate got hotter as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which started about this time. My personal take on that is the climate would have gotten hotter even if there hadn't been an Industrial Revolution. That the climate simply, it goes through cycles, but again, not everybody believes this. In fact, 90-some% of your scientists will tell you, no, it's not that way. But then again, anyway, the Little Ice Age ended, the Industrial Revolution started, and a lot of folks say that we started putting out carbon in the atmosphere. Each of you can believe what you wish to. All right. Trade became more worldwide. The first industry that was made in factories was the textile, or in other words, textile is another name for cloth. Now, at one time, cloth was made mostly by a spinning wheel. A homemaker or housewife, or even an old maid, would take some wool and spin it round and round and round and make a big thread out of it. And then they'd make another thread and eventually weave this